We come to the 13th presentation, and this will round out the set of presentations on a refinement of species. Among the major endeavors that I've been blessed with having the privilege to perform over the last half century, one of the most unusual came in 2006. I was asked by Colonel Jesse Marcel's grandchildren to write a chapter for a book they were going to do for the 60th anniversary of Roswell and the UFO incident there. Because of complications with family generational politics, that book has been deferred. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the interstellar symbols from the Roswell UFOs, because it is germane to our species' understanding that we must carry through with the refinement that has been before us now for about 5,000 years. And halfway through, about 2,500 years ago, we were given an enormous boost up. And 2,000 years ago, we were given a kind of a differential template in a spectrum that could diffuse and create a morphological development throughout the planet in many different civilizations and many different cultures. And now here in the 21st century, all of this is coming both together and being prismed into a very large spectrum. There are 12 symbols from the Roswell UFO that were together on a very small I-beam made out of a very light metal, and the symbols were in a kind of a purple against pink, or they were pink against purple. And they were reconstructed out of memory from the son of Colonel Marcel, the father of the grandchildren. Grandchildren are Jesse Jr., Denise, and John. I have put the 12 symbols together in an order so that one may read, literally, another star system's symbolic expression of how you travel between star systems. This is the first symbol, and I won't go into them in detail. There's a 20-page chapter on this, which I will publish separately if need be. This is the first. This is the second symbol. This is the third symbol. We are traveling through more dimensions than space-time. This is the fourth symbol. Notice that there is an inversion that is possible because of a space that's created in a continuum. The fifth symbol gives us the two developments The continuum now is in a pair that barely touch. They touch at one point only. The sixth symbol is the inversion of that. The seventh symbol is that the touching now is like a contact, not a single point, but like a corridor. Small in terms of the symbols, but if these are symbols of star systems, you have a very large contact in terms of our kinds of sizes. This is the eighth, where that contact now creates a tuned space that will allow for the ninth symbol, where there are now a pair of pairs, that the spaces not only separate and tune, but they tune a pair of pairs. The 10th symbol is the four brought together like a interstellar four-leaf clover. Very big magic. Very sophisticated leprechauns. The 11th symbol is a craft that is able to occupy the spaces as they were. Hyperspacers are better usage. And the 12th symbol is that the craft is able to renormalize itself in terms of a space that is now within reach of ordinary space-time. And if you look at this 12th symbol, you'll recognize that there is a remarkable semblance to the sun rising over a pyramid. So that there are star systems that have intelligent species, intelligent beings, who have mastered the context between star systems for who knows how long. The current age estimated of the universe is 13.7 billion years. Our sun has occurred for about 4.7 billion years, which means that there were 9 billion years before our star system even formed. It is time not simply to be humble, but to be wise about being wise, and to go through with the refinement before us that we must participate as participants in an interstellar frontier. In order to do this, my analysis had to coin a term for these symbols, and I went back to the more ancient pictorial writing bridge between symbols and pictographs, and that is glyph, as in hieroglyphics. So I called these interstellar symbols, I gave them the name magnetoglyphs, because the energy continuum underlying this kind of symbol morphing set, and it becomes a set because all of the stages are resonances, and all of the resonances form a complete harmonic, and that one of the requirements for that of a harmonic set is that it have a radial symmetry and not just a bilateral symmetry. In ordinary space-time, a bilateral symmetry will stylize the way in which existentials will occur, and that the entire cycle of their development will be aligned. Our structure has a bilateral symmetry. Electricity has a bilateral symmetry, positive and minus. Computers have a bilateral symmetry, zeros and ones. However, if you shift your bit from 0 and 1 to 0 and infinity, now you have a radial symmetry, which gives you something unlike a tree, like a logic tree or a tree of life, but it gives you something like a star, like the human hand. And the quintessential aspect of a radial symmetry is that the fifth element in it is the magic trigger. It's the thumb that allows for the paw to become a hand, and for the hand to become a conveyor of mudras. And in just that way, the quintessential dimension added to the 4 dimensions of space-time is that of consciousness. And that the opposable thumb of the 5th dimension of consciousness is that it is not in the integral cycle, but it is a differential transformer of that cycle through an ecology of phases. So that consciousness comes into play as a differential field and matches in a complementarity the integral field of nature. And in order to set one into the orientation that allows for a deep transform appreciation, a numerical value of 0 is given to the field of nature, and the numerical designation of 1 is given to the existentiality that is able to come out of it. The ancient Chinese phrase was Tao and Te. Te is the power to occur because it has a polarizing stability, whereas the Tao does not need a polarity. It doesn't need a stability. It is the field within which a stability, an equanimity, could occur and do occur immediately. One of the aspects of the development of something that polarizes and is able to exist is that it comes out as a unity. The whole point of existence is that it is a unity. It is a oneness. That oneness conveys its primordiality to all of the developments that happen within it. An exemplar for this is modern cosmology, considering the Big Bang, and that what came out was a quark plasma. It was unified, and that the universe for 300,000 years, approximately, in terms of modern cosmology, was a singular quark plasma that was expanding because it was continually emerging, and the continual emergence gave it an iterative quality, a vibrational structure, and that as the vibrations expanded, there was a time where the integral of the unity lent its primordiality to quarks coming together in pairs, in triads, and by the time they came into triads, you began to have structures, 3 quark structures like a proton. And the polarity and the unity kept its primordiality so that one eventually had element like a proton and an electron making hydrogen. But again, one sees in the primordiality that there's a triple level of energizing this, so one can have hydrogen, one can have a heavy water hydrogen, deuterium, one can have a third state, tritium. If you move to what would be a fourth state, you have a different element, you have helium, which now is a pair of protons, a pair of neutrons. This quality of the atomic number of what the nucleus holds, the number of protons, the number of neutrons, has what are called magic numbers, where the protons and the neutrons are kept in a equivalence. One of the most recent discoveries and attainments in nuclear science is the making of the isotope tin-100. Tin-100 has 50 protons and 50 neutrons. 50 is one of the magic numbers. They are 2, 4 helium, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82, 126. And by having the nucleus packed with an equivalent number of protons and neutrons, you have a nucleus that is stable to an extraordinary extent. In the symbols from Roswell, what was evident after quite some while of high-level analytic and a deep experienced critiquing of symbols was that the operative quality of this was that it was a mathematical art language, and that it was speaking in symbols in such a way that those symbols, in their transparency, the transparency of each symbol in the set and of the set as a harmonic whole, could be read not symbolically, but could be read in reality. So that it is not simply the pilot or the navigator who reads the symbols, but the UFO itself co-reads those symbols. So that one has a symbiosis between the occupants and the ship. They tune together and they, quote, read together, and that the symbol harmonic allows then for a transposition out of 4-dimensional time-space via a 5-dimensional differential conscious opening, not a gate, not a stargate. That's fictive. But it allows then for the dimensions to quickly jump into what Michio Kaku was calling a 10-dimensional hyperspace. But that 10-dimensional hyperspace is not so much a space, but is a third field that generates out of not its form, but out of its process, generates, in fact, the field of nature, which operates in terms of the quote hyperspace. Nature now operates as an 11-dimensional field process, but its operative quality registers in terms of an arithmetic designation as a perfect zero. One of the first persons in the world to be able to understand what a computer could be was Johnny van Neumann, who died in 1955. And he was one of the first persons to make an advanced computer called the differential analyzer. If you ever get a chance to see the old film When Worlds Collide, made in 1951, there's a sequence in the beginning of it where they show an original differential analyzer working, and one can see this is a precursor of some very strange machines. Johnny van Neumann, before he died of cancer, many of the genius men who worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, died very early of cancer. Enrico Fermi, Johnny van Neumann, many of them. He writes he was due to give the Silliman Lectures at Yale University in 1956. He became incapacitated. He wrote 2 short articles that were published then in 1955 by Yale, and it's called The Computer in the Brain. The Computer and the Brain. He writes, "It must be noted, however, that it is a priori unlikely that the nervous system should use such devices as the main vehicles for its memory requirements. Such memories, more characteristically designated as memories made up from basic active organs, are, in every sense that matters, extremely expensive. Modern computing machine technology started out with such arrangements. Thus, the first large-scale vacuum tube computing machine, the ENIAC, relied for its primary, i.e. fastest and most directly available memory, on flip-flops exclusively. However, the ENIAC had a very large size, 22,000 vacuum tubes. It was the size of a room. And by present-day standards, a very small primary memory consisting of a few tens of 10-digit decimal numbers only." Towards the end, he has talked about the concept of codes, that the development of many special code languages during the Second World War led to a great surge of genius. And towards the end, the language of the brain is not the language of mathematics. Pursuing the subject further gets us necessarily into questions of language. As pointed out, the nervous system is based on 2 types of communication: those which do not involve arithmetic formalisms and those which do, i.e. communications of orders, logical ones, and communications of numbers, arithmetical ones. The former may be described as language proper, the latter as mathematics. A proviso here. One which goes back to the esoteric wisdom arithmetic is not mathematics. An arithmetic is still a counting process, and has for its work the integration of what it is that you are counting. And numbers will have a kind of a bilateral symmetry. Mathematics is a deep transform of mathematics, and the first person to be able to employ that transform was Pythagoras. So that one of the classic books that has come down, reworked and presented, and the first great English translation was done by Thomas Taylor in the early 1800s, is called The Theoretical Arithmetic of the Pythagoreans. Greek, theoria, means contemplative. It means a visionary consciousness. That one is able to read through numbers to their meaningfulness, but the meaningfulness is not in the numbers, but in the way in which the symbolic arrangement of the numbers allows one to read through it to the visionary contemplative meaning, and one who has the ability to read through the symbols into the field of differential consciousness. Now, when they make forms, they make differential forms. The difference between an individuality and a person. The difference between a symbolic structure and an artistic prism. Mathematics is the language of the art of prismatic form. And someone who becomes very gifted or very developed in terms of math is actually an artist. One can have an elegant equation. One can develop, in fact, such a mathematical aesthetic capability that you can make a new kind of mathematics. And one of the great examples of that in the middle of the past century was Richard Feynman, making the Feynman diagrams. Because he could read through the higher mathematics of the nature. He was working at the time on quantum electrodynamics with Julian Swinger and Tominaga and a number of other individuals. But he had been trained by John Wheeler at Princeton, the man who coined the term black holes. He was also in touch with a number of the greatest mathematicians of the day, like P.A.M. Dirac. And the Feynman diagrams allow for one to take the mathematics out of algebra, out of arithmetic, and to be able to go back to a glyphic presentation. They are more glyphs than they are diagrams. They are called diagrams by those who cannot read them. They are glyphs to those who read them because they do not read them, they read through them. It's as simple as having learned to read. You do not look at the ink on the page. You do not look at the individual letters of the words. You look at the words, and someone who can read very fast will not look at words, they will look at whole phrases. Or they will speed read and learn how to read whole paragraphs. And that the mnemonic retention is of a very high order. It isn't following each word with your finger. That's arithmetical. That's numerical. Now you can, the phrase is, lift the words off the page. You can read out loud, and what happens then is that the mythic horizon of your experience transforms. If what you are reading out loud is not an arrangement bilaterally, but a prismatic presentation radially, in which case you have a poem. If one reads a poem aesthetically, poetically, out loud, the whole nature of the way in which the brain arranges language heard, oral language, oral discourse, and will begin to hear not just between the lines, but be able to hear because of a function of remembering, braiding with the function of creative imagining. One will be able to hear the poem as it unfolds in its wholeness. And one will have this aesthetic sense, and a great mathematical demonstration is like reading a poem. Only one doesn't read it out loud so much, but one reads it in one's voice within. But even then, you do not hear it as someone who is reading hears in their mind the words pronounced. You do not hear it, but there is a special silence that is eloquent in which one is able to share this with others. One of the aspects of a radial symmetry is that it is shareable. But to get to the shareability of it, one needs to go through several stages, several phases. The first stage of which is to exceed what was your existential, habitual, mental, integral limitation. The second is to experience that there is a mutuality that two or more can follow together and can understand together. The simplest exemplar of this was there was a time when human beings, Homo sapiens, transformed to Homo sapiens sapiens, and one of the great developments later on, after they got used to being Homo sapiens sapiens together, that they could sing together. And one of the most startling developments that one sees is that a written language, starting about 3500 BC, one of the earliest qualities of a written language as it transformed from a numeracy to a literacy is that the literacy took itself out of the arithmetical and went into the mathematical, into a radial symmetry, and one began to have sacred hymns that could be sung together. The first great collection of hymns that we know of are the temple hymns of Enijuana, who also wrote the great myths of Inanna. But the set of 42 temple hymns by Enijuana, about 2300 BC, was used as an archetypal text to teach for more than 2,000 years. Out of the use of the cuneiform transform to literacy by Enijuana and Sargon of Akkad, her father, it took about 1,200 years for the development of an alphabet. And the first alphabets occur in ancient Ugarit on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And from all of this, we come to 1955, on his deathbed. The last paragraph that Johnny van Neumann wrote reads this way. Thus, logics and mathematics in the central nervous system, when viewed as languages, must structurally be essentially different from those languages to which our common experience refers. It ought also to be noticed that the language here involved may well correspond to a short code in the sense described earlier, rather than to a complete code. When we talk mathematics, we may be discussing a secondary language built on the primary language truly used by the central nervous system. Thus, the outward forms of our mathematics are not absolutely relevant from the point of evaluating what the mathematical or logic language truly used by the central nervous system is. However, the above remarks about reliability and logical and arithmetical depth prove that whatever system the system is, it cannot fail to differ considerably from what we consciously and explicitly consider as mathematics. There is a refinement in that second deep refinement of our species. The first from Homo sapiens to Homo sapiens sapiens, by art, by the alchemy of art. The second transform is by the cosmochemistry of science to Homo sapiens stellaris, where the capacity to read through the transparency of symbols of higher mathematics allows to be brought into play a neural equipment tuning that together are able to go into what colloquially is called a higher reality, a 10-dimensional hyperspace, and to re-emerge back out of it again and again, because as van Neumann points out, the nervous system will be alternating between a digital and an analog many times in the way in which the body communicates through the nervous system to the brain, and the brain back through it to the body, so that a kind of a bifocal lens occurs. But one can have a refinement of that, where it is not just a bifocal lens, but to bring in the concept that conveys it today, adaptive optics. So that one's mind is able to refine indefinitely, infinitely, the detail into whatever specification one needs to have, and to work with that. Not in time-space, not in space-time, but in reality. We're going to take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back to our species refinement. The first refinement is done by art. The second refinement is done by science. Art comes out of a field of differential consciousness. Science comes out of a kaleidoscopic flow of historical experience. The historical experience, because it is kaleidoscopic and not mythically linear, it does not follow plot lines. It branches out like trees or bushes, would branch out and puts roots down. The roots go into the visionary field, and the branches leaf out and curl so that in part of the cycle of history, those leaves curling become flowers. It's the way in which evolution actually happens. Flowers came into play on this planet about 70 million years ago, about the time that primates began to come into play on the level of monkeys, on the level of great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, that about 7 million years ago began to become upright, and after a couple of 3 million years became hominids, of which we are a very refined species coming into play about 200,000 years ago, undergoing an alchemical transform about 40,000 years ago, and now undergoing a cosmochemical transform, a second transform, so that the species that is in play now creatively, memorably, is actually a third level, a very high energy level, not a high power level. It's not about power, as we'll see. It's about an energy refinement that is further tunable to zero and infinity, being the field and the kaleidoscopic possibilities by which we are able to bring arts and sciences into the ecology of consciousness. It's important to understand the difference between a cycle and an ecology. An ecology will return creatively. A cycle will continue. It tends to continue, as we would say, mechanically. When you wed, and that's the proper term for this, when you wed a cycle with an ecology, 4 dimensions of the natural cycle, 4 dimensions of the cosmic differential consciousness, the process that engenders is a complex 9-dimensional. The ancient designation was even the Aeneid. One can go back to 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC. The original Egyptian religious structure was 4 pairs of gods that were manifested by an unnameable 9th original god, Atum, A-T-U-M, a forerunner, I think, of the Greek use of the word atom, or the ancient Hebraic use of the word Adam. The 9th is the way in which the 8 as a set makes a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. The way that the whole becomes a greater than the sum of its parts is that it is not a form but is a process, but is not a flow process like myth or history. It's a field process like nature or visionary consciousness. That third field generates what we would call eternity. And its symbol is an infinity sign. And the original infinity sign was tilted perpendicular so that it was like a figure 8. but the figure 8 was repeated again and again so that there was an accordion glyph of figure 8s, and this was the original way in which one understood eternity. That this 8th, as it repeats iteratively, has the ability to be a special kind of time. And the translation of the ancient Egyptian term is living time. Eternity is lived forever. But it is lived forever in the sense that it is an ecological iteration of the eternal field that brings into play not existence, but brings into play nature itself. And one of the little logical aspects of this is that you can substitute zeros for infinity or infinity symbols for zeros in higher mathematics, and the logic will not be impaired. It's as if one could use for the bloodstream for a while the saline brine of the ocean. It will not poison you, whereas fresh water introduced into the bloodstream will kill you very quickly. It is a peculiarity that is brought out in the work of Lynn Margulis, especially. And she has something extremely important to say about symbiosis. And her great 1998 book was called Symbiotic Planet. And in the book, in her work of over 40 years, she was Carl Sagan's first wife. Her oldest son, Dorian Sagan, has written many books with her. In the front of Symbiotic Planet, they list a number of books by her, and one can see that the titles of her books fill a whole page. She's now about 70 and teaches at Amherst. She used to be at Boston College for many, many years. She writes, symbiosis has affected the course of evolution as profoundly as biparental sex has. From an evolutionary point of view, they are analogous. They both entail the formation of new individuals that carry genes from more than a single parent. In organisms that form by the sexual fusion of two parents, the parents have a very recent common ancestry in terms of evolution. Partners in symbiosis share only far more distant ancestors. When parents or gametes fuse to form a zygote nucleus, meiosis will occur at some time later in the life cycle, restoring individuals capable of sexual fusion, adolescents. The cyclic nature of symbiosis is far less regulated. In some cases, the symbionts never return to the individual state. In others, there are definite and regular methods for ensuring alternation of the individual in symbiotic states. In no symbiosis are methods of restoring individual partners as elegant as the meiosis fertilization cycles of advanced eukaryotes. Geneticists have defined parasexuality as a process that leads to recombinant individuals with more than one parent, but bypasses the meiosis fertilization cycle of biparental sex. This was a textbook on symbiosis and cell evolution published in New York. The most recent book of great genius on this spectrum of evolution is On the Origins of Phyla by James W. Valentine, published in 2004 and the University of Chicago Press. And Valentine has worked on this level of scientific genius for a very long time and writes, "The body plans of phyla have been much admired as representing exquisite products of evolution, in which form and function are combined into architectures of great aesthetic appeal." Notice the term architecture here. There is an art involved prismatically that complements a cyclic structure that works pragmatically. Not the blending, but the tuning of pragmatic and prismatic gives you the, quote, adaptive optics option for refinement almost indefinitely. The phrase adaptive optics is well taken because it is meant to counter the distortions that are there because of natural circumstance. In astronomy, it's because there's an atmosphere to the planet. One can use refinement of optics to be able to have the almost indefinitely sensitized adjustment of a field of expanding aspects so that now one can have a telescope not with a fixed lens but with a pixelated lens of indefinite size that is able to adjust instantly, minutely, to any kind of atmospheric conditions and restore the image that is brought not through one aperture to a mirror or to that mirror to a second mirror, but to a third mirror. In just this way, the ancient wisdom of a thrice greatest, the wisdom of a second refinement of man leading to a third level of his Homo sapien capacity, is very apt for this. And here is a little bit more of James Valentine. While the phyla seem relatively simple in their basic designs, most contain branches that form important variations on their structural themes. And some body types display remarkable embellishments in their morphological details. Presumably, these variants reflect something of the ranges of ecological roles and environmental conditions in which the various phyla have evolved and functioned. The origins of phyla are very remote, going back about 500 million years. One of the most surprising findings of developmental genetic research is that similar suites of regulatory genes control patterns of gene expressions in organisms with very different architectures. As different as nematodes, insects, and mammals, for example. Clearly, those regulatory genes were not much changed even during the evolution of such disparate phyla. Nevertheless, the patterns of expression mediated by the regulatory genes have clearly had to undergo major remodeling to produce new body plans during the evolution of phyla. There must have been considerable evolution in the relations between given transcriptional regulators and their target genes. It also seems plausible that the number of gene expressions events increased as more complex organisms arose. An interstellar civilization will have a symbiotic radial patterning to it. It will not so much be alien as extraterrestrial, because the common denominator, ancestry, will go back even deeper than star systems in their existentiality. There will have been life patterns billions of years before our star system even formed. So that there is not only a mutuality that is possible in terms of individualities getting along together, but on a deeper symbiotic common denominator, there will be a quality of shared presence. The peculiarity will be being unfamiliar, not with differences of presence, but with presence. What obviates the sensibility, the refinement of Homo sapiens sapiens to presence that Homo sapiens originally did not have, is that they were interested in preservation by power. The way in which this is statable, I've written out so that it becomes a little more coherent and not as combative as it will seem at first hearing. To ordinary mentality, extra dimensions like extraterrestrials are vague and ill-defined. To extraordinary consciousness, extra dimensions and extraterrestrials spectrum the cosmos. To ordinary mentality, the power of now relies on a present point, which knots the nature cycle into a closed loop, which runs dry eventually. The idea of a present point or moment of being power is actually parasitic. Socially, this is a tyranny. To think of time as freezable, that this is the acme of power, a PowerPoint presentation, curtails the field of nature's fertility towards healthy integrals and regresses the field of consciousness creativity towards wholesome differentials. The ritual habit of numbering steps tie this knot and secure the PowerPoint now becomes a characteristic of delusion. 7 steps to success, etc. Such rituals suffocate vision and obviate art. They destroy and distort history into regressive mythologies, which produce what Richard Feynman used to call cargo cult science, named after the New Guinea natives who discovered a crashed American bomber from World War II on an airfield that the Americans had built in New Guinea. So they reconstructed the airfield. They found the equipment from the crashed plane in the plane, and they would sit in the plane with the equipment on and wait for a new plane to land. And it was such a consternation to them that they felt they had to find the right magical rituals to make it work. And as Richard Feynman said in describing this one time at Caltech, he said, planes have never landed on that airstrip. Cargo cult science. The science that does not work, that cannot work, is when vision has been regressed back into a mentality which commandeers it for a sense of power. It tyrannizes in such a way that ritual comes to dominate where art would be in the ecology of achievement, and instead of having prismatic persons, one has obedient citizens. And instead of having the kaleidoscopic history that is necessary even for a planetary culture, much less a stellar civilization, much less putting us into play on the interstellar frontier, one has increasingly an abstracted illusion that one is doing something that will eventually work. And like we have seen in the last 6 months to a year, even such a complicated mentality as world economy, finally, because it is knotted into a closed loop, runs itself into being unable to be pragmatic as well as prismatic. It is suicide to sit in a cargo cult and on one hand be fearful and on the other hand be hopeful that others will come and take care of us as they must always have done to mature us. This is not only going to work on this planet, it doesn't work in star systems, it doesn't work in interstellar civilizations at all. Our capacities are such that we are able to understand quite clearly by now how to proceed. In 2001, Nature, the weekly international journal of science, published a resource book, the Nature Yearbook of Science and Technology, that listed at the time all of the institutions in the world that practice science and technology. And you can see the size of it. We can get to page 2120. And this was 8 years ago. It's now quite a bit more extensive. What is interesting is there was a time when you could have listed in a publication like this on half a page. That time was the 17th century. You would have had the Royal Society in London. You would have the American Philosophical Society, not yet brought into play because Benjamin Franklin hadn't been born. You would have had some French societies left over. One of the star societies was called the Pleiades, the 7 wise people of France at the time, and a couple of more in Italy. The jump in capacity came with the publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica, because it taught our species the confidence that you can refine to any point of exactness that you need if you will master not the principles of arithmetic, but the art of mathematics. And the precursor to that was Newton's work on optics. Because as a young man, though he was a mathematical genius, Isaac Barrow at Cambridge was one of the best mathematicians of the time. Barrow came out of the generation that produced logarithms, for instance. But Newton's work on optics taught him that seeing is not a matter of identifying, but of characterizing. And that perception by light can be distributed over a rainbow if one is able to put the prism into place. And the prismatic person is able to take the carrier of electromagnetic energy and prism it into its full rainbow, its full spectrum, a true rainbow covenant. Noah received a rainbow covenant from his ark, and Newton showed that that covenant was able to be refined. The Principia Mathematica introduced calculus in its integral and differential equations, and to teach and to show that in this way one can understand that no matter where you are in the universe, it is a universe. The refinement came with Einstein in understanding that the universe itself is prismatic and becomes a cosmos of relativity in the sense that we can take timelines for worlds, and that these world lines then have an ecological consistently everywhere that existence would come into play in a space-time continuum. And that space-time continuum includes the ability for transforms by conscious understanding. And this is exactly where Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein met, that it isn't that the observer affects the experiment, it's that the observer is a dimension in a differential field that generates possibility and increases the possibility by prismatic kaleidoscopic opening, and that what comes out of this actually into play then are infinities that are real. When infinities are real, it is delusional to not nature at the point of mentality through an identification that this is how it must be. This is truly delusional to believe, especially because both aspects of that identification are appearances. The ego as a static, permanent individual not only does not exist, but can be experienced to not occur. The classic example from the previous generation was Zen. But any good contemplative or prayer or yogic endeavor will disclose that. We talked last week about Paul Newman and his love for race cars. Learned, he said, that it wasn't the race and it wasn't the car, it was becoming part of the road. And in that way, one has this at one-ment by dissolving the knot that would have limited you in your sense of a conception of individuality. Like a good participant in an art of life, there are many aspects of roles that you can play. There are many characters that your character is capable of. And that those you are with, if the dramas are interesting and elegant, the ecology of consciousness comes into play that it does two immediate transforms. One, the field of consciousness enriches the field of nature so that the zero is not an empty zero, but a full zero. Becomes fertile. And two, remembering becomes a part of the structure of symbolic thought as the memory, not just the memory arithmetically of recall of an integral cycle, but of a memory of previous cycles that one would have participated in. The classic case of this was the historical Buddha. In order for his previous lives to be recalled in a harmonic of humane proportions, they were called the Jataka tales. 550 previous lives of the Buddha when he was a monkey, when he was this, he was that. And so the Jataka tales, they run to about 3 huge volumes. The previous lives of the Buddha is a differential, kaleidoscopic, harmonic way of presenting 2,500 years ago that it would be a beggar's position to settle for an individuality of identity that you assume is statically there in the present moment, which is statically there, because nothing would be more brittle and fatal than that. The only true death there would be is if there were a static identity in a static present moment. That would be the most fleeting, brittle quality imaginable. That it does not exist is good news. We're part of a very interesting kaleidoscopic road. Next week we'll go into shared presence, which is the continuity of how all of this came down to us through history and into the future. We're going to go back a little bit with the new past and to go forward quite a bit with the future. The most interesting aspect that comes out of this, when you play the accordion of the repeating eights, living time extends out to an infinity, and in that silence one is able to hear many choirs, many kinds of beings who are distinct in terms of their planetary origins or their star system origins, but who could sing together. One of the most charming presentations of it in 1977 was the Star Wars Alien Bar. There are all kinds of adventures. There's no need to really fear, as long as one gets rid of the fearful knot. A knot, mathematically defined, is a one-dimensional self-avoiding complication that continues to avoid into its own complication. Next week, something new.